Hey, welcome back to Talent ID and Development. This is part number 4. I'm Russ Tucker. Thanks for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed and been challenged by the series so far. Today we tackle one of the more topical and most often debated issues in the field, which is that of the 10,000 hours versus talent question. And so some people have argued that talent doesn't exist and it's all about the 10,000 hours. And so I want to go right back to first principles and just explain where that theory comes from and why I don't believe that it's actually constructive. What we'll do in subsequent parts is go into a little more detail about the implications of buying into 10,000 hours, because you might think that there's actually no downside to encouraging people to practice more, but in actual fact the evidence suggests that there are potential pitfalls and that you might actually be reducing the chances of succeeding. Besides which, 10,000 hours doesn't fit with a budget definition. I gave you the tactical and strategic definition of Talent ID, and hopefully today you'll see where that starts to have some implications. I don't want to labor the point too much in the intro. Let's rather spend more time on the actual presentation, which again you can see below this video, or you can follow with my voiceover. Enjoy it, and I'll chat to you after. Right, so part 4 is going to introduce us to certainly one of the more controversial and widely discussed subtopics in the whole Talent ID and Development field. And that's the issue around whether performance is the result of genetic factors, which is to say predetermined and inherited, as opposed to whether performance is the result of the young athlete's engagement in deliberate practice and the accumulation of those training hours, which is the programmed model. Now, the reason it became so controversial was in part because it was popularized by a couple of best-selling books, the most famous of which was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. And what these books did, and I'm giving the game away a little bit up front here, is that they created what I believe is a false dichotomy. It's an incorrect and unnecessary polarization where they put genetic factors on one side and training on the other, and then trying to argue for training somehow managed to scorch the concept that any genetic factors at all would be required or important for performance. So effectively it became a binary argument, X versus Y, and the argument was made that it's all training and therefore talent and genetic factors have no bearing on performance. And the research on which this argument was based has got some flaws in it, and I'll take you through some of those. Its originators, the scientists, and even some of those authors have subsequently argued that it was never their intention to reduce the importance of genetic factors, but I think certainly what happened was the message came across pretty strongly that that was the case. I'll show you some examples. And in the end, what was a theory to try and encourage a good thing, which was that people should practice a little more, became accepted as dogma, and it actually had many undesirable consequences. And so we've got to cover all those different aspects as we move forward in the next few parts of this series. So we're talking really about hardware, which is to say your talent, and your software, which is to say your training. Now, very important point that I just want to make right up front is that whenever you are dealing with a complex phenomenon, and sporting performance is one of the most complex phenomena you can imagine. It is the result of so many different factors that when you are dealing with that, you cannot fall back on these kinds of either-or binary scenarios. This dichotomy of saying it's either this or that is almost always guaranteed to be incorrect. And that's the same, by the way, in many different areas. If we look at the moment, there's a big debate in diet about fat and carbohydrate, and people say it's all carbs' fault. Other people have argued it's all fats. Both are incorrect. It's never going to be all or nothing, and all of one and none of the other. So please bear that in mind. And just to conceptualize that, I could ask you, looking at this picture, do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? Now, if you're looking at it and you can only see the duck, then my suggestion is call someone else to have a look, and maybe they'll see the rabbit, and together you will see all of it. In other words, someone else's perspective will help you see more than you are able to see on your own. But chances are you can see both because it's simple. Similarly, this is a very well-known picture of either a young woman or an old woman. And again, if you can only see the young woman, someone else may be able to point out the features that will help you see the old woman. And the point I'm trying to make here is that when we look at things, we see them through our own lens, Other people may see them differently, but if we are so stubborn and so certain of ourselves that we dismiss what other people see, then there is a good chance that we're only seeing 50% of the picture. So rather be open to the possibility that there's more to it than what you can see. And so with that in mind, if we look at performance, this is a complex picture. Do you see talent or do you see training? And are you open to the fact that maybe you should be seeing both? And if you can't see talent or training, then maybe you need to call someone over to say a few things to you and point out the features that will make you identify and recognize the whole picture instead of just half of it. So with that in mind as well, and I admit here that I'm sticking to this false dichotomy just as a way of introducing the concept, just because it's simpler to do that way. But let me just run you through the two, broadly speaking, theories that exist on opposite extremes here. The first one dates back to 1869. The second one is more recent. The first study was actually in 93, but I'm going to show you a quote from 2009. And again, remember, it's not a rabbit or a duck. It can be both. However, the talent theory comes from Galton in 1869, and he had noticed that parents who were taller tended to have taller children. In other words, there was something that the parents were able to pass down to their kids, and in this case it was stature. So he writes that, and then he says, then it will be true as regards every other physical feature. And he lists a number of them, all related to the brain and the head, and thence a step on which no physiologist will hesitate as regards mental capacity. So what he's basically saying here is that if height or stature is inherited, tall parents, tall kids, then so will mental capacity, which in this instance is 1869 language for intelligence and IQ and intellect. And so he's basically saying that we inherit our intelligence. And this argument was made, as you can see, with a great deal of certainty. No physiologist will hesitate. In fact, many would. And the whole issue around intelligence is extremely complicated. But if I can summarize this into an image, what Galton is saying is not that practice doesn't make a difference. In other words, he'd recognized even then that you could still learn and become better than you were. But what he was saying is that no amount of training was going to take you from the level that your inherited factors were going to keep you at to a level that other people might have as a result of different inheritance. So I've just illustrated here with 4. So everyone improves with practice, but some people respond enormously well and they reach the Olympic Games. Other people make their national teams. Other people play club, and then down here you get the likes of me who don't do any of it. You just get to talk about it. So the point is that practice helps, but there's a ceiling beyond which we cannot go as a result of things that we've inherited. And remember, they didn't know about DNA and genes back in 1869. They just knew inheritance. And so that's Galton's argument. In juxtaposition to this is what Ericsson discovered or popularized in his research, and I'll show you some of that. And this is just one quote that encapsulates it. The distinctive characteristics of exceptional performers are the result of adaptations to extended and intense practice activities that activate dormant genes that are contained within all healthy individuals' DNA. Now, the geneticists among you are probably wondering what a dormant gene is, so am I. But the key thing in this is that he is saying that exceptional performance, in other words, your performance level, is the result of practice which activates genes, and key for me is this here, all healthy individuals' DNA. So Galton is saying that there are differences in us because of genetic factors in our performances. Ericsson is saying that all individuals contain them. And so that is how I would graphically represent the Ericsson model, is that your performance is a function of training time. And there are a number of other quotes that I could have used here. I've chosen to select that one, but you'll see the argument as it develops. Now, the origins of that particular theory and what came to be known as the 10,000 hour rule come from a study that Ericsson did in 1993. He went along to the School of Music in Berlin, and he had the music teachers evaluate all the incoming students for their ability to play the violin. So now, you must remember, you're dealing here with all the students who have applied to study a musical instrument professionally, and they are going to therefore represent the top 1%. Now, this is not some amateur violin player who hacks it over weekends. This is a person who is actually committed to studying that instrument. And the music teachers listen to them play, and they grade them as either best experts, good experts, least accomplished. The amateur piano were as control group, and professionals was another control group that he used. And then what he did was he looked at the number of hours that these, 20-year-olds had played the violin from the time that they began. And he gets this really elegant separation where the best experts, by the time they turn 20 and are chosen to go to the university to study the violin, have accumulated just over 10,000 hours. So that's a really elegant number. 10,000 is round, it's perfect. And this is where the rule came from. Because what he discovered is that those players who were judged to merely be good had only done 8,000, and the least accomplished had done just under 5,000. Professionals, in hindsight, did the same as the very best. Amateur piano players, as you might expect, did very little. And so the conclusion from this study, which is, it's not full of errors, but there's some key mistakes and oversights that prevent you from making this conclusion. Nevertheless, Ericsson made it, is that the development of expert performance is primarily constrained by engagement in deliberate practice and the quality of the training resources available to them. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate the difference between this model and one that says that natural ability and talent or innate factors are responsible performance, because if you subscribe to that one, then your explanation for the best expert violinist compared to the least accomplished is that this person was just gifted, was born with something that made them more able to acquire the skills to play the violin, whereas this person got unlucky in the genetic lottery and therefore couldn't succeed. Whereas what Ericsson is offering you, if you're in this group, is an explanation that lies within your control. In other words, if you just do 5,000 hours more, then you too can become a best expert on the path to becoming professional. So it's not difficult to see why this theory became so attractive. Now, Ericsson may have been offering it as a recommendation for training, which nobody ever in the history of humankind would say is incorrect. Nobody is going to tell you that practice doesn't help you get better. The issue is whether you can go from this position into that position with practice alone, which is what Ericsson is saying. The problem then came that a number of journalists picked up on that study and others similar to it, and the idea that practice is recommended slowly morphed into becoming sufficient. So this here is a quote from the aforementioned book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. And talking about the 10,000 hour study that I've just shown you, he says the striking thing is that he and his colleagues could not find any naturals, musicians who floated effortlessly to the top while practicing a fraction of the time their peers did. In other words, nobody gets to being the best expert or the professional without doing the 10,000 hours. So this is saying that practice is necessary. You cannot succeed without it. And not just any practice, but the 10,000 hour concept, if you think back to what that graph looked like. And then Gladwell doubles down on it. He says, nor could they find any grinds, people who worked harder than everyone else, yet just didn't have what it takes to break the top ranks. In other words, what he's saying here is that nobody who does the time doesn't achieve the performance. In other words, practice is sufficient. It's therefore necessary and sufficient. And this is a key distinction that was made. And Ericsson has argued that he didn't say this, and if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you would certainly say that it was Gladwell. But this is where the 10,000 hour concept was taken. And that's why it became a rallying cry as opposed to a guideline. It became cheerleading, it became a law, is that if you practice, you will succeed, and if you do not, then you won't, but if you do, then you will become one of the best. And so that's the problem. And finally, just to wrap that up, Ericsson offers the following quote from someone called Daniel Levitin. The emerging picture from such studies is that 10,000 hours of practice is required. In other words, it's necessary to achieve the level of mastery associated with being a world-class expert in anything. No one has found a case in which true world-class expertise was accomplished in less time. Now, if I just stop there and I ask you to think in your domain, whether you are a school teacher, whether you are a parent, whether you are an athletics coach, whether you are coaching football, tennis, cricket, rugby, whatever it is, I guarantee you that you can find a case where world-class expertise was accomplished in less time. So it's this slide that captures how the message was distorted. And what had merit, and it wasn't the best study ever, and I'll get to that, but what had merit as a call to practice more became a call that practice is all that matters. And that's what we want to try and avoid. That's the slide that made it look like a duck when we should have seen a rabbit and a duck. Now, I've alluded a couple of times to some issues with the study, which I think undermine the conclusion that it eventually drew anyway. So aside from the fact that it has subsequently been taken and distorted into this false dichotomy that I spoke of, there were some issues around the method and the presentation of data that I think is also important. And I want to just talk about those quickly first. The first one concerns the idea that when you measure performance and ask people to retrospectively think back on how much they practiced, you are inviting all kinds of issues, not least of which is that you're relying on memory. That if you look at this, you're asking people to think back 12 years. Now, that's not necessarily a deal breaker for a study, but there is an important potential omission here, because you can't tell whether the practice determines the performance or whether the performance determined the practice. And so if we go all the way back to when these violinists were 8 or 9 years old, and the graph shows you that that's the point at which they started to practice. And if you have a look at that, you can see that within the first 2 years, there is already separation between those who are going to go on to become the best, those who are going to become good in light blue, and the amateurs and the least accomplished in purple and dark blue, respectively. So by the time these kids were 9, 10 years old, there was already a difference in their practice time. Now, Ericsson has argued that this difference would go on one day to determine their performance. But there's a possibility that their performance ability determined their practice. In other words, those who were good at it are the ones who practiced more. And so if you scrolled across and you looked at that gap getting larger and larger, you don't know whether the best violinists are actually practicing because they're simply better as a result of some innate predisposition to being better at it. And that's missing from the study. So it's an important oversight potentially, because the separation of those trajectories happens so soon at this point that it's possible that ability drives practice. How? Well, one is enjoyment. Kids generally don't do things that they don't enjoy. That's a lesson I'm sure all parents are well aware of. And secondly, permission. So parents encourage kids who are good to do more of it, and they discourage children who are not good to seek something else that they are good at. Now, you and I can debate whether that's good or bad parenting and whether that's a good or bad message. But you can't deny the fact that someone who expresses ability is more likely to practice it more than someone who does not. And Ericsson's study could not account for that. So that's the first issue. The second issue also concerns something that's missing. And if you just look at this graph, which I redrew from the Ericsson paper using literally all the data that was available in it, what you will notice is conspicuous by its absence are any measures of variance or range, maximum, minimum, standard deviation, standard errors. And the reason that's important is because if the theory is that 10,000 hours guarantees you becoming a best expert, and if less than 10,000 means that you can't get there, then it would be very helpful to know that every single person in the best expert group did in fact do the time, which would support the quote that I showed you from Malcolm Gladwell. In other words, that there were no people who floated effortlessly to the top on less time. And similarly, there would need to be no people who got to the best level, who were in the least accomplished level without doing the time. That's what Malcolm Gladwell called grinders in his quote, which I showed you previously. But the problem is Ericsson didn't show that, so we don't know if these people exist. So this is the person who falls into the least accomplished group, but is found to have done 10,000 hours because they show that volume alone is not enough. And secondly, this is a person who falls into the best expert group, but who's done far less. And that shows you that practice is not necessarily a prerequisite to become a world-class or an expert performer in this case, playing the violin. So that suggests that there's something else. Now, one rebuttal that I've heard about this is that something else is the quality of the training. And there's no question that some people practice better than others. And so if you want to become world class at anything, it makes sense, this is something nobody ever again would dispute, that your quality of training has to be better than just going there and kicking a ball around or hitting a ball against the wall. You have to practice in a way that makes you better. So people who argue for this 10,000 hour concept tend to dismiss these possibilities as, hey, he simply obviously didn't practice at a high enough quality, whereas this person got more bang for buck for his training. My argument is that if you do that, you've basically created what is an unfalsifiable theory, because now no one can ever come along and say that it's not 10,000 hours. And if that's the case, well, then it's not 10,000 hours. All you're saying then is that a lot of high-quality practice is what makes people better. And again, no one's going to give you any prizes for saying that, and you're not going to change anyone's current thinking. So the absence of these individuals in Erikson's paper is key. Now, you might be wondering whether they existed or not. Well, according to Gladwell, they didn't. But as a result of the debate on this issue, I actually wrote a review article which was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, and Anders Ericsson responded to that, and in his response acknowledged that in fact these people did exist. So in other words, there are people who are grinders, who do the time and don't succeed, and there are people who float effortlessly. And what does that tell you about the 10,000 hour rule? It's just not worth holding on to as a rule. And just to make that point, finally, this is a subsequent study that was done on chess players in 2007, and what they found was that on average it takes 11,053 hours to become a chess master. So you would know that chess has got a very formal and well-controlled scoring system, and so you can become a master, and it's recognized, it's a nice objective measurement, and it takes, sure enough, pretty much the same time as it took those violinists to become experts as well. So that's great, but what they did show in this study, unlike Ericsson, is standard deviation. And when you see a standard deviation that is equal to half of the average, then you know that there's a massive spread. And so then you can guess, and this is a fact from the paper, is that there were some people who became masters within 3,000 hours, and there's another guy who'd done 25,000 hours and was still counting. He still hadn't gotten to the master's level. So that's what I mean when I talk about range. And again, come back to our definition of talent ID. It's about deciding who best we are going to allocate scarce resources to. Question I'd ask you is, would you rather spend your resources on this person or this person? And I say that not to be harsh, but the reality is that you can get 8 people to become masters if you spent it here compared to 1 there. So that should inform your thinking a little bit about this. And so just to wrap that up, this is the summary of that. So you're going to get always this huge spread. Black bars here represent masters, experts, and intermediates. And yes, the more people practice, the more likely they are to be good or master level compared to expert, compared to intermediate. But there will always be people who don't succeed despite doing time. So 1 in 4 people needed more than 10,000 hours, and 1 in 8 needed 5,000 hours or less. And my argument would be that's who you want to spend your money on. What about sport? This is a study. This is not WWE wrestling. It's Olympic wrestling, Olympic field hockey, and Olympic football. 6,000, 5,000, and 4,000 hours is the average time for elite athletes to get to the elite level, the so-called expert level. So in sport, and I'm sure that you can all relate to hours, I would argue that you're an inefficient investment. And so the point is that if you can find people who can achieve expertise faster, then that's desirable for many reasons. And really the main one is the resource return. And that's why we do invest in looking for people who we believe have a predisposition to success. And that predisposition has to, at least in part, be determined by genetic or innate factors. So that's a fundamental issue that you have to understand. And it's the reason I say that you shouldn't look at this as one or the other. It's not training or talent. It's the search for talent that is most effectively trainable in order to spend your budget of time, of money, of people, of equipment, facilities, energy most effectively. So bear that in mind. And that's a wrap for your introduction to the 10,000 hour concept as opposed to talent. And I hope that you can appreciate that putting them in opposition to one another was never necessary, and it's counterproductive. And so performance is too complex to just say, practice for 10,000 hours and you'll succeed, because A, it's incorrect, B, it causes problems in the real world. And that's why it was so important to me to start off in part 1 of this with that definition. That Talent ID informs decision making and informs budgeting. So it determines where you allocate your resources. And 10,000 hours would skew that if you bought into it as a dogmatic rule. So take the concept, take what's good about the concept, but try not to get stuck, because it becomes so limiting and ultimately so inefficient. And that's what subsequent articles or video posts on this will cover, is some of the implications and the consequences of rigidly buying into a 10,000 hour concept. So I'm going to leave that for now. This has been a long video, but within the next few days I will go further into the 10,000 hour concept as it pertains to specialization and exactly how we need to manage athletes to maximize their chances of success. So I look forward to chatting to you then. Until then, happy talent spotting and happy training.